growing up in Arkansas was not the easiest place for me because I was already very visibly gender nonconforming. I presented in a masculine way, even as a very young child. And so while there were some great things about where I lived, it was difficult for me socially. So moving to Cambridge was really wonderful. I came out as gay when I was 13, and at the time, there were not a lot of representations of queer folks in mainstream media that I could find. So I was seeking those kinds of representations, and I was looking in fine art photography books to find those. So the books I was seeking out often centered around identity or centered around queerness. And I was kind of just looking at everything. I didn't know anything about the history of photography, but one of my earliest influences was Catherine Opie, and I discovered her work in one of these books that I found. And that was hugely influential to me and really validating to me because it showed me that there were people out there who looked like me. It showed me I was part of a community. It instilled in me this sense that art making can be politically and socially and emotionally powerful. And so those early experiences were really important. I discovered photography, first of all, I just fell in love. It just seemed like the medium that clicked for me. I just didn't want to do anything else. I just wanted to make pictures and be in the darkroom, and I was totally obsessed. But I also very quickly realized that I could channel my energy as an activist into my work. And so that's something that I've always done. And I've always felt that my voice as an activist is the strongest through my photography, particularly now. My earliest pictures were not so different from my current pictures in terms of what I was interested in. I was making portraits, I made self-portraits, I was immediately drawn to photograph my peers. I was making work about sexuality and gender from the very beginning. So obviously my skills have deepened and my expertise has increased, but my core interest as an artist has remained the same. When I make a portrait, I often spend anywhere between 1 and 2 hours working with the subject. And for me, that is informed in part by my working method. It is informed by the fact that I worked on a 4x5 for a long time, and I work very formally. I have my camera on a tripod. I use all natural light. I am very collaborative with the subject. There's a lot of back and forth about poses and gestures and facial expressions. So for me, that process really allows me to slow down and create an emotional space with the person that I'm with, where they can offer something of themselves to me and be fully present. So some of it is emotional. I like to work alone. I don't like to have a crew. I like to lock into this emotional space with the person that I'm photographing. And then some of it is technical. It takes me a little while to find the photograph, to see how the light is falling on a person, to see where in their house is the most visually interesting, to find a gesture that feels visually interesting but resonant to them and specific to them. So some of it is me finding the photograph formally, and some of that time is me settling into an emotional space with the subject. And that was important to me because I was looking for representations of queerness. And then I watched films like Boys Don't Cry, which is a difficult film in a lot of ways. And these representations were meaningful to me, but now as an adult, when I think back on them, both of these films centered around or had elements of violence against queer people because they were queer. And so I'm very aware that the representations I saw as a young person were not yet fully nuanced and complex. There was this threat of violence, or they did center around a kind of discrimination. And so that's something that I'm aware of in terms of how it affected my own psychology, but also thinking about my work and what I present in my work, and showing more expansive views of identity and queerness, and just being aware of how a lot of the representations that were more mainstream of queer identity or trans identity were either negative, focused on violence, were highly sexualized. So I'm really interested in making work that is deeply human, that's about more complicated things, more complicated emotions, more complicated experiences, that happens to be made from my particular point of view. I have always made self-portraits from the very beginning. It's been a core part of my work, and it's something that I've actually really jumped back into heavily in the past couple of years, partially because of the pandemic and partially just because of where my work is right now. And for me, I find it challenging. I find it great and exciting in some ways because you always have access to yourself, so I can always do that. But it's certainly more technically difficult to not be able to look through the lens in real time. The external things like galleries and museums and the art world, that can be tricky and difficult and slow to access. So I think it's really important at a core level that as an artist you know why you're making your work, and that it feeds something in you that's not external. And that I think is really critical. That having been said, in my opinion, the process of making work and the process of showing work are two very different things. And, you know, being an artist takes one skill set and one level of commitment, and then building a career as an artist takes a different skill set and a different commitment. So the last project I released was To Survive on This Shore, which was a project that combined photographs and interviews with people who are transgender and gender expansive and over the age of 50. So that body of work had a very clear educational mission. It was more documentary than some of my other work. It was received really well in the press. It got a lot of attention. We got a lot of interviews. And it really allowed me to do a lot of programs that were more geared at education, and I loved that. However, it was so specifically about trans identity that I'm aware of the risk of being pigeonholed a bit as only making work about trans identity. And so I've been working on my long-term project, Every Breath We Drew, and I'm working on releasing a book right now, which is, the layout is what you can see behind me. And I'm really interested in putting something out in the world that is super personal, super subjective, really about my own experience, really about a more nuanced and complicated experience of being a person and connecting with others. And a lot of that is just where my work is right now and what I want to say. But I'm also very aware on a career level of wanting to follow a project that was so documentary with something that is more personal and open-ended, because I really don't want to get pigeonholed as making work only about trans identity. That's not really what my work is about at its core. And I am very aware of how things get digested in the media and how that often reduces something complicated to something that fits into a headline. So that is something I think about. And, you know, outside of my fine art work, I do some editorial work, and I love when I get hired to make a portrait when it's not specifically queer, not specifically trans. And, you know, thankfully that's happening more. But I do think any artist who is part of a group that has historically been marginalized butts up against this, where you want to make work from your own experience, but you don't want it to be perceived in a reductive way, and you don't want to be pigeonholed to only making work about that. You want to be able to be a more open-ended, nuanced artist. So that's something I'm definitely thinking about.